Have you ever wondered what lies beyond the moment your heart stops beating? What if death isn't the end, but a doorway to something far more profound than we've ever imagined? In 2018, a man named Brian Miller experienced something that would forever change not only his life, but challenge everything we think we know about consciousness, death, and what comes after. For 7 full minutes, Brian was clinically dead. No heartbeat, no brain activity. By every medical definition, he had crossed over to the other side. But what happened during those 7 minutes would leave doctors stunned, scientists questioning their understanding of reality, and millions of people around the world reconsidering their deepest beliefs about existence itself. What Brian saw will challenge everything you believe about life, death, and the nature of human consciousness. It started as a normal Thursday afternoon. Brian Miller, a 41-year-old construction worker from Ohio, was at home with his wife when he suddenly collapsed. No warning signs, no previous symptoms. One moment he was standing talking about dinner plans, and the next moment he was on the floor, his body completely lifeless. Paramedics arrived and began CPR immediately, shocking his heart with a defibrillator again and again. Nothing worked. In the ambulance racing toward the hospital, they continued their desperate attempts to revive him. Still nothing. When he arrived at the emergency room, the medical team took over with even more aggressive intervention. Minutes passed. 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. After 5 minutes without oxygen, brain damage becomes increasingly likely. After 7 minutes, it's almost certain. But then, at the 7-minute mark, something extraordinary happened. Brian's heart suddenly started beating again. Against all odds, he was alive. But the real miracle wasn't that he came back, it was what he brought back with him. When Brian regained consciousness 3 days later in the intensive care unit, he was remarkably clear about one thing. He remembered everything. And what he remembered was impossible. Brian told his doctors that he had floated above his body. He could see the medical team working on him from a perspective near the ceiling. He described in perfect detail the frantic movements of the doctors and nurses, the equipment they used, and even conversations they had during the resuscitation. But here's where it gets truly unexplainable. Brian described specific events that happened in other rooms of the hospital, rooms he had never been to, events that occurred while his brain showed zero electrical activity. He told a nurse about a red shoe on a ledge outside a third-floor window in a completely different wing of the hospital. Skeptical, the nurse went to check. The shoe was exactly where Brian said it would be. He described a family in the waiting room having an argument about whether to leave or stay. Hospital staff confirmed this argument had taken place at the exact time Brian was clinically dead. How could a man with no brain function observe events happening in distant parts of a hospital? The medical team had no answers, but Brian's experience was just beginning. After floating above his body, Brian says something pulled him away. He describes moving through what felt like a tunnel, traveling through space itself at an impossible speed toward something he could only describe as pure light. As he moved toward the light, Brian says he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Every fear he'd ever had simply disappeared. Every worry, every anxiety, every moment of pain or suffering in his life became insignificant. He felt completely accepted, completely loved, in a way that transcended anything he'd ever experienced in his physical life. The light, he says, wasn't just illumination. It was conscious. It was aware. It communicated with him, not through words, but through pure understanding. In an instant, he felt like he comprehended the entirety of his life, every decision, every moment, every connection he'd made with other people, and none of it was judged. It was simply understood, accepted, and loved. And then he encountered something even more shocking. People he knew who had died were there, waiting for him. Brian's mother had died when he was 16 years old, 25 years before his cardiac arrest. But in that space beyond life, she was there. He recognized her instantly. Not by her appearance, but by her essence. She communicated with him in that same wordless way, and he felt her love more powerfully than he ever had when she was alive. But she wasn't alone. Brian's grandfather was there, a man who had died when Brian was only 7 years old. And here's what makes this truly remarkable. Brian's grandfather communicated specific information to him, information that Brian had no way of knowing. His grandfather referenced a family secret, a piece of information about Brian's grandmother that had been hidden for decades. When Brian later told his elderly aunt about this detail, she went pale. It was true. It was something that only 3 people in the entire family had known, and 2 of them, including his grandfather, were long dead. The third person, his aunt, had never told anyone, including Brian. This wasn't a vague feeling or a comforting vision. This was specific, verifiable information that Brian could not have possessed through any normal means. One of the most profound parts of Brian's experience was what he calls the life review. In what felt like an instant but also an eternity, Brian experienced every moment of his life from a completely different perspective. He didn't just remember events, he experienced them again. But this time, he felt what other people felt. Every act of kindness he'd ever shown, he felt the joy and relief it brought to others. Every cruel word he'd ever spoken, he felt the pain it caused. Every moment of indifference, every time he'd ignored someone in need, he felt the loneliness and rejection they experienced. It wasn't punishment. It was understanding. It was seeing his life through the eyes of love and complete honesty. The life review taught Brian that we are all far more important to each other than we realize, and that love and kindness are the only things that truly matter. At some point during this experience, Brian became aware that he had a choice. He could stay in this place of peace and love, or he could return to his body. Everything in him wanted to stay. But then he thought of his wife. He thought of his 2 young daughters. He felt their grief, their pain at losing him. And he understood that his time on earth wasn't finished. The moment Brian made the choice to return, he felt a sudden, violent pull. The peace disappeared, the light receded, and he was slammed back into his body with a force that felt like hitting concrete. Brian says the hardest part wasn't dying, it was coming back. It was leaving that place of perfect peace and love and returning to a world that suddenly felt heavy, difficult, and limited. So how do scientists explain what happened to Brian Miller? The short answer is, they can't. Not completely. The medical community has studied near-death experiences for decades, and there are several theories, but none of them fully account for cases like Brian's. Some researchers argue that near-death experiences are caused by a surge of brain activity at the moment of death, but this theory has significant problems. Brian's brain showed no activity for several minutes. The information he acquired about the red shoe and the family argument couldn't be explained by hallucinations. Hallucinations don't provide accurate information about events happening in other locations. Dr. Sam Parnia, a critical care physician and leading researcher in consciousness studies, has documented hundreds of cases like Brian's. He argues that these experiences suggest consciousness may not be entirely produced by the brain. Instead, the brain might act more like a receiver or filter for consciousness, rather than its generator. When the brain shuts down, consciousness doesn't disappear. It's simply freed from the physical limitations of the body. This is a radical idea that challenges fundamental assumptions in neuroscience. But the evidence from cases like Brian's is difficult to ignore. What happened to Brian after he came back? The answer is, everything changed. Before his cardiac arrest, Brian was focused on material success. He worked long hours, pursued promotions, worried about money, and measured his worth by his achievements. He was often short-tempered with his family and disconnected from any deeper sense of purpose or meaning. After his experience, all of that changed. Brian became intensely focused on relationships, on being present with his family, on expressing love and kindness to everyone he encounters. He left his stressful job and found work that allowed him more time with his daughters. He started volunteering at a hospice, helping people who are facing death. But perhaps most surprisingly, Brian lost his fear of death completely. He describes death now not as an ending, but as a transition, a return to that place of peace and love he briefly visited. And that freedom from fear has transformed how he lives every single day. Of course, not everyone believes Brian's story. Skeptics raise valid questions. But what makes Brian's case compelling is that he's not alone. There are thousands of documented cases of people reporting similar experiences. And these reports are remarkably consistent across cultures, religions, and belief systems. People who've never heard of near-death experiences report the same elements: the tunnel, the light, the life review, the encounter with deceased loved ones, the overwhelming sense of peace and love. Dr. Bruce Grayson, Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia, has spent over 50 years researching near-death experiences. His research suggests that near-death experiences are not random hallucinations, but follow consistent patterns and produce measurable, lasting changes in personality and behavior. Brian's story forces us to confront some of the biggest questions humans have ever asked. What is consciousness? Is it produced entirely by the brain, or does it exist independently? What happens when we die? Is death truly the end, or is it a transition to another form of existence? Does this prove that there's life after death? Not definitively. Science doesn't deal in absolute proof, only evidence and probability. But it does suggest that our current understanding of consciousness and death is incomplete. There's something happening in these experiences that we don't yet understand, something that challenges materialist assumptions about the nature of reality. Brian Miller was dead for 7 minutes. During that time, he experienced something that transformed not only his life, but his entire understanding of existence. He saw beyond the veil that separates life from death, and what he found there was not darkness or oblivion, but light, love, and a continuation of consciousness that defies everything we think we know about reality. Perhaps the most important message from Brian's experience isn't about death at all. It's about how we live. The life review showed him that every action matters. Every moment of kindness ripples outward in ways we can't imagine, and the connections we make with other people are the only things that truly last. Love, compassion, and presence are what matter. Everything else is temporary. Brian says that if his experience teaches anything, it's this: we should live as if we already know that consciousness continues, that we're connected to something vast and loving, and that our time here matters more than we realize. We should treat each other with the kindness and understanding we'd want if we could feel what others feel. 7 minutes changed Brian Miller forever. But his story can change us too, if we let it. It can remind us that there's more to existence than what we can see, measure, or prove. It can inspire us to live with more love, more purpose, and less fear. And maybe, just maybe, it can give us comfort in knowing that death might not be the end we've always feared, but rather a doorway to something beautiful beyond our current understanding. What do you think? Have you or someone you know had a near-death experience? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this video made you think differently about life and death, please hit that subscribe button and the like button. Thank you for watching, and remember, every moment matters. Live like it.